Hi, welcome to the Ielts Facebook Live. I'm really sorry, I'm a little bit nervous because it's the first time I'm doing it. With me is Pete Jones, who is an Ielts specialist from Free Ielts course, and he's been helping students like you prepare for the course for well over 10 years. So he really does know his stuff. Without further ado, I will hand over to Pete. Oh, I should say that what he's going to talk about is how to manage your time in the Ielts listening and reading tests. And also, I've got my producer, Liz, who's on the other side of the screen, whom you can't see. And she's telling me to slow down a bit and wait for people to come and join us. So I am. So we're going to just stay here for a little bit longer to allow people to join us. And if you've only just joined us, this is the Ielts Facebook Live event with Pete Jones, who is an Ielts specialist, and he's going to be talking through how to manage your time in the Ielts listening and reading tests. So he's going to give his top tips, and you're going to have an opportunity to ask him any questions, make any comments you'd like. He's going to go through quite a few things, and we're going to be here for the next 20 minutes to half an hour, so you're going to have plenty of opportunity. Also, if you missed the beginning, don't worry about it, because this is going to be recorded and it'll be on our website and you can come back to it anytime. I can see that we've got a few people joining us already, and I'm just waiting for my producer to tell me when we can go live to Pete. In the meantime, Pete is actually joining us all the way from New Zealand. So I think the time is, what is the time over there, Pete?
It's 10:30 in the evening.
10 evening. Oh, I'm really grateful that you're taking this time and then quite late at night for you to join us to give us your tips. I can see that we have some comments already and asking for some reading tips. Previously, leading up to this Facebook event, we'd also been asking you to tell us what are the things that you'd like us to talk about as well. And throughout the course of the next half hour, Pete's also going to be addressing those issues and those questions that you might have come up with. Is that right? That is right, isn't it, Pete?
Yeah. It is, yes. I've been watching some of the posts on the Ielts official Facebook page and seeing what people are asking and what issues they're having around managing time in the Ielts test.
Great. So we're going to stay here for a little bit longer, or?
We can start.
Oh, okay. We're ready to start. So Pete, you ready?
I'm ready to go.
All right. So on the agenda, I think the first thing that we've got is, well, actually, I'll let Pete introduce that to you. So over to you, Pete.
Thank you, SJ. So I first just want to say thank you for this opportunity to share some tips on the Ielts official Facebook page. And I'm broadcasting live from Auckland, New Zealand. It's 10:30 at night here. And it would be great to know who's out there listening. So please leave a comment saying where you are right now. As SJ said, I'm going to be sharing some tips on how to manage your time in the Ielts listening and reading tests. And one of the main reasons why candidates don't do as well as they can in the Ielts test is not using the time in the best way, not using their time effectively. So if you've got any questions related to this, feel free to post them in the comments section, and SJ will have an opportunity to ask me some of your questions at different points over the next 20 minutes to half an hour. So we're going to start with the Ielts listening test. And for those of you new to Ielts, the Ielts listening test includes 4 sections, is 30 minutes long with an additional 10 minutes to transfer your answers. you only listen to each section once, and the listening recordings include people with different English-speaking accents. So, for example, people from New Zealand, Australia, the UK, Canada. And yeah, the first tip. So the first tip for managing your time in the Ielts listening test is to not listen to the example at the beginning of section 1. So I said before that you only listen to each recording once. There's one exception to this, which is at the beginning of section 1, where you are played an example twice. And because you only have a limited time to look at the questions before each recording starts, a good way to get a little bit more time is to not listen to that recording of the example, and to instead use that extra time to look at the questions so that you're ready for what you need to be listening for. And you should be able to see an example on the screen now of the part I'm talking about, the example that comes at the beginning of section 1.
We have a slight technical problem, but as soon as it comes up, I'll hand it over.
That's all right, SJ. Okay. So the second tip is to use that time before the recording starts to circle or underline words in the recording, words in the questions that are going to help you remember easily exactly what you're listening for. It's very difficult to listen and read at the same time, and a lot of candidates get lost when they're listening to the recordings because they're trying to read the questions again and follow what they're hearing. If you circle or underline words in the questions that are going to help you easily see what you're listening for without having to read the whole question again, this makes the listening part a whole lot easier. In the example that you should be able to see on the screen now, you'll see in the first question there that I've underlined the word grade. And this is so that when I look at that question again when I'm listening, it's very easy for me to see that I'm listening for a grade, which could be a letter like A or B, or perhaps a percentage like 80% or 100%. And I don't need to read the whole question again. And in the next question, I've underlined the word cancelled and written the word what, so that I can very, very easily see that I'm listening for something that has been cancelled without having to read the whole question again. And this makes the task of listening and reading at the same time a lot easier in the Ielts listening test. You'll see also on that screen that there's a question below, question 23. And I haven't circled or underlined any words in that question. So it would be great if you could have a quick look at that now and put in the comment section what word or words you would underline or circle that's going to help you remember what you're listening for really easily. So I can't see at the moment what comments we've got, but what I'll...
Okay, some of the comments we got was, should answers be in capital letters? And how to assess writing during preparation. How to assess writing during preparation. Do bear with us, this is our first time doing this.
So I think I can quickly answer that IELTS listening question, that it doesn't matter if you write in capital letters or lowercase letters, as long as your writing is clear. So if your writing isn't that clear, perhaps it's safer to write in capital letters. Yeah, I'm interested to know if what people would circle or underline in that question 23, if you can see that on the screen. And then I'll go on and share my answer.
Okay.
So SJ, I'm happy to go on and share my answer to that question, and then move on.
Can you just give in? I'm just adding. I'm trying to add the slide, but unfortunately, it's not letting me do that. So if it's possible to share your screen, that would be good. Because at the moment, for some reason, it's just not letting me do it.
Okay. It might be
annoying.
Because there's already both of us showing on the screen, SJ, and you.
Ah.
Okay, so we can come back to that slide a little bit later if we need to. So the two tips I've shared so far for managing your time in the IELTS listening test are not listening to the example at the beginning of section 1 and circling or underlining words in the questions that are going to easily help you remember what you're listening for once the recording starts, so you don't need to read the whole question again. My third tip for the IELTS listening test is, if you realize while you're listening that you've missed an answer, perhaps you heard the answer but you didn't recognize the word, it may have been a new word for you, is to not focus too much time on that and just cross it out and continue listening. What can happen quite easily in the IELTS listening test is, if you spend too much time thinking about an answer that you've just heard and are not sure about, you may actually miss the next 2 or 3 answers in the recording and perhaps lose your place completely. So it's very important that if you're not sure about an answer, that you just cross it out and move on. My fourth tip to use your time well in the IELTS listening test is, at the end of each section, so at the end of section 1, section 2, and section 3, when it says you now have half a minute to check your answers, you should not check your answers, and in fact look ahead to the questions in the next section. As I said before, you don't have a lot of time to read the questions before the recording starts. So using this extra time at the end of each section is a really good way to give yourself some extra time to look at those questions. And you have 10 minutes at the end of the listening test to check and transfer your answers to the answer sheet, which is enough time to do that. And so you don't need the time at the end of each section to check your answers. And it's better use of your time to look ahead to the questions in the next section. This is particularly important at the end of section 3, leading into section 4, because section 4 is the most difficult part of the listening test. And it's useful to have as much time as possible to look at the questions. So, just to recap the 4 listening tips, I hope SJ is able to share the summary screen. So you can see the 4 tips. Number 1, don't listen to the example at the beginning of section 1. Number 2 is circle or underline words in the questions that are going to help you remember what you're listening for. Number 3 is cross out questions that you know you've missed. And number 4 is look ahead to the questions in the next section when each section finishes and it gives you time to check your answers. So, SJ, before we move on, are there any questions? Okay, so if there's no questions, I've just seen a question come up on the screen there around brackets. So if you're using an official Ielts listening test and you look in the answer key and you see an answer within brackets, that means that part of the answer is optional, and it's okay if you include it, and it's okay if you don't. So let's move on to tips for managing your time in the Ielts reading test. And for those of you new to Ielts, I'll just give you a quick overview of the Ielts reading test so that the tips make more sense to you. So the Ielts reading test comes in 2 different types. There's the academic reading test and the general training reading test. In both tests, you have 60 minutes to answer 40 questions. In the academic test, there are 3 long academic texts for you to read and answer questions on. And in the general training reading test, there are 3 sections, with the first 2 sections containing several shorter texts and the 3rd section containing 1 longer text. And my first tip around using your time well in the Ielts reading test is to have a plan before you start, so that you know what you're going to do first, second, third, etc. For example, you should know which text or section you're going to start with. You should know how much time you're going to spend on each text or section. You should know whether you're going to read the text first or part of the text first, or whether you're going to look at the questions before you look at the text. And you should decide when you're going to transfer your answers to the answer sheet. Are you going to do this after each text or section? Or are you going to wait until you've done all 3 texts or sections before transferring your answers? The reason why this is important is because if you're not sure what you're going to do first, second, third, and you're having to make these decisions in the test, you're using up valuable time. And so you really need to go into the test, the reading test, with a plan and stick to the plan. Now, I won't have time in this session to go into each of those points, but my next tip is related to the first of those points, which is which text or which section are you going to start with? And my suggestion is to start with the text or section that is easiest for you. You don't want to start with the most difficult one because it may take you longer than you thought. You may lose confidence because the questions are more difficult or the text is harder for you to understand. And so starting with the text that's easiest for you can give you a good start in the reading test. You're more likely to be able to keep to the time that you've set for each section and not put so much pressure on yourself compared to if you started with a more difficult text and took longer than you had planned for. In the Ielts General Training reading test, the first section is always the easiest section, and so I recommend starting with that and then moving on to section 2 and ending with section 3, which is the most difficult section. With the Ielts academic reading test, however, the first text may not be the easiest one for you. If the topic of the text or the type of question in the text is not one that you are familiar with or confident with, it may be more difficult for you, and perhaps the second or third text might be more familiar, a more familiar topic or more familiar questions for you to answer. So my suggestion for the Ielts academic test is, before starting, is to take a really quick look at each of the 3 texts and decide which one you think is going to be easiest for you, which topic is most familiar to you, and start with that one. And I mean a really quick look, so no more than a minute, really, before making a decision about where to start. So, just to recap with Ielts reading, my first tip is to have a plan before you go into the test. And my second tip is to start with the text or section that's easiest for you. My next tip is to remember which types of Ielts reading question follow the same order as the information in the text. So there are lots of different types of Ielts reading question, and 4 of those are always in the same order as the information in the text, and 2 of those are usually in the same order. And I won't list those at the moment, but I'm going to ask SJ to post a link in the comments to where you can find this information about which types of question are in text order. And what I'd like to show you now is why this is useful, or how this can be useful to know this. And I'm going to use an example of a type of question in IELTS reading that a lot of candidates find very difficult. And a lot of you said recently on the IELTS official Facebook page that you needed help with. And that's true, false, and not given questions. So true, false, not given questions are where you are given a statement and you have to say if that statement is right or wrong according to the information in the text, so true or false, or if that if we cannot say, if we don't know if that information is right or wrong, given the information in the text, and that's not given. And the reason why I'd like to focus on this question is because there's a tip that, or a strategy that you can use to help answer these types of questions more quickly. And you should be able to see now an example on the screen of a true, false, not given question. And you'll see that I've underlined a couple of words. And I'm just going to remind myself which words those are. So you'll see that I've underlined in question 5, you'll see that I've underlined foraging teams. And in question 6, you'll see that I've underlined in the company of ants. Now, I've underlined those words because they are the only words in all of those 6 questions that I'm sure are not going to change in the text. I'm going to see exactly those words in the text somewhere. And that means they are going to be much easier to find than other words in the text. The words that are usually easiest to find are the ones that don't change, and those are usually names, like the name of the essay in the company of ants, numbers, or scientific terminology, like foraging ants or foraging teams in question 5. Now, if I start with those questions instead of starting with questions 1, 2, 3, or 4, I'm going to be able to find the answers to those questions much more quickly, because those words are not going to change. Those underlined words are not going to change. And once I've found those answers, I can be very sure that the answers to questions 1 to 4 come before those in the text. Because this type of question, the answers are nearly always in the same order in the text. So identifying where question 6 is and where question 5 is will make it much easier for me to find questions 1 to 4, because I'm going to be looking in the right part of the text and not wasting time looking for that information in the wrong part of the text. My next tip for the IELTS reading test is to number each answer in the text when you find it for the first time. And you should be able to see an example on screen now. And you don't need to read that example, but just see that answer 11 and answer 12 are underlined. And the reason why this is useful is because there's a very good chance you'll need to go back to some questions and find the answer again and read it again to make sure that you are happy with your answer. And you don't want to waste time trying to find an answer that you've already found once before. So the first time that you find an answer, underline it, put the question number next to it, and then if you need to see it, if you need to find it again, it's going to be much quicker for you. My final tip of the night around using your time well in the IELTS reading test is about difficult questions. So there will be questions in the IELTS reading test that are difficult, and there are probably going to be some questions that you won't be able to answer. And because each question is worth the same, so the easiest question is worth 1 point, and the most difficult question is worth 1 point, you should spend your time answering the questions that you're more likely to get right, and not waste too much time on the most difficult questions. So if you get a difficult question, my advice is to leave it and move on. And then if you have time, come back and have another look at it. Or if you run out of time, you'll just have to guess the answer. So, the 5 tips that I've given around the IELTS reading test and managing your time in the IELTS reading test are showing on the screen now. So have a plan before you start the IELTS reading test. Start with the text that's easiest for you. Remember which types of question are in text order. And true, false, not given questions are one type of question that are almost always in text order. Number each answer in the text when you find it for the first time. And don't waste too much time on difficult questions. Move on, guess the answer if you need to. So, yeah, SJ, any questions there that I can answer?
Okay. Hi. Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me? Hi, Pete. Sorry that you lost us a bit earlier. We're not really sure what happened there.
Okay.
We're streaming simultaneously, but on different screens. So for those of you for whom there was a break in transmission, we really apologize that the slides didn't come up on time and it all went a bit funny. I do have some questions here for you.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm not sure what that is.
If we write small letters.
If we write small letters, is it necessary to write the name and place name in capital letters or block letters? And this is true.
Yeah, and this is a really common question around for the IELTS listening test. And it's not necessary to write proper nouns like names, names of places, names of people in capital letters, or to start them with a capital letter. You can write them in lowercase letters. What's important is that the spelling is correct, not whether it's a capital letter or not. And what's important is also that your writing is clear.
Okay, I think that answers that. Here's another question. Is it true that section 1 is easier?
And is this about the IELTS listening test or the IELTS reading test?
I think it's the listening test.
Okay. So yes, it is true. So in the IELTS listening test, each section gets more difficult than the previous one. So section 1 is the easiest, and then section 2, section 3, and section 4 is the most difficult.
Great. Here's another one. If you get 28 marks in the listening test, what is the band score?
So usually you need to get 23 out of 40 for a band score 6, and 30 out of 40 for a band score 7. This is the information that's available publicly. So from that, we can assume that 28 out of 40 will be a 6.5. But I have to say usually, because each listening test may have a slightly different level of difficulty. Some listening tests are slightly easier than others and some slightly more difficult. And so those scores required might change slightly. So perhaps for one listening test, you need 23 out of 40 to get a band score 6. But in another listening test, maybe 22 or 24 is what you need.
Okay. We have another one. What is the best way to transfer answers after each section? Or can we put it all at the end? I think that's what that is. Yes.
If the question is about the IELTS listening test, then it has to be at the end, because you have the 10 extra minutes after the last recording stops to do that. And you want to use your time during the listening test when you are given time to look at the questions. You want to use that time to look at the questions so that you know what you're listening for. If that question is about the IELTS reading test, then you have a choice, because you don't have any extra time at the end of the reading test to transfer your answers. You have to do it within the 1 hour. My general advice is to do it after each section, because if you leave it to the end, you may be running out of time. You may rush it, so have to do it very quickly. You may make mistakes when you're transferring your answers. So, yeah, my recommendation would be to do it after each section. Okay.
Why are passages so complex where time is limited? I think that's a question that every exam taker will ask.
Yeah, and I guess I'm hoping that if it's about the IELTS reading test, I'm hoping that the tips we talked about today will help people use their time better in the IELTS reading test. There are certainly ways to use your time effectively, and I talked about some of those today. You can't change the fact that some of the texts are going to be quite complex and difficult to understand, but you can change the way that you do the reading test, and use techniques to manage your time better, to use your time in a better way.
I have a couple of true and false questions. One is it wise to attempt the true false not given at the end? Because we've been talking about putting things at the end as well. And the other question is how to fix the confusion between true and false.
They're big questions. They're very big questions. But I guess in answer to the first question about when to do true, false, not given questions, I think I'm going to go back to my tip around starting with the text or the section that's easiest for you. And if you're doing the academic reading test and you look at the three texts and the questions, and one of the texts is on a topic that's familiar to you, that you feel you know a lot about, and the types of question it has are ones that you feel more confident with, I think you should start with that. If there's a text there and you don't even understand what the topic is, and you see true, false, not given questions, and you're not very confident with those, then perhaps that's good to leave to the end. In terms of understanding the difference between false and not given, SJ, can you share that screen again with that example of true, false, not given?
Is that the one with the underlines? True, false, not given.
It's the one before that, SJ.
Which slide number was that?
Slide 6.
Right. Okay. I think that should be on the screen now. Slide 6. Okay. I'll just. I think that's the one. Slide 6. Can you see that?
Not at the moment. I can see that another slide.
All right. Let me see. I'm going to take myself out.
Okay.
Sorry. Okay, the slide reads, government policies have frequently compounded the environmental damage the farming can cause.
No, it's not that one. It's the one that shows questions 1 to 6. And it's the questions and not the text.
Questions 1 to 6. One moment. I'm afraid I don't have that one. Slide 7. Right. Questions 1 to 6. So Liz tells me it's slide 7, so I'm just going to. That's the one. Nope, that's not the one. That one.
Yay! That's it. So I'm hoping everyone can see that question, and so one way to tell the difference between true, false, or not given is to change the statement into a question. So, for example, question 1, you can change into a question. Do ants use the same channels of communication as humans do? If you read the text and you can answer that question, yes, ants do use the same channels of communication, then the answer is true. If you can answer that question, no, so ants don't use the same channels of communication, then your answer is false. If you can't answer that question yes or no, because the text doesn't give us that information, then the answer is not given. So that's one way to help understand the difference between true, false, and not given. Change the statement into a question and then see if you can answer it with the information in the text.
Okay, Pete. I think that was, as you said, that was a very big question, and I think that was quite a thorough answer. Now,
she had a question for you. We went back to going back to the beginning of the broadcast. I asked where people were from, where people were listening from. Have we got some comments saying where people are at?
Yes, we've got people from Mexico. We've had someone who's listening to us from Australia, so around the same time zone as you. We've got someone from Bangladesh, and we've got someone from New Zealand as well.
Wonderful.
And, yeah, they didn't say exactly where in New Zealand though. And we definitely have. So I've said Bangladesh, Mexico, Australia, New Zealand, Pakistan. Anywhere else? I don't think. I'm just asking my producer whether she's seen. Those are the main countries that have joined us.
Okay.
In fact, I should tell everyone anyone who's just joined us recently, that you're listening to Pete Jones, who is an IELTS specialist who has been giving top tips on how to manage your time in the listening and writing test. You will be able to see a recording of our live broadcast, and we'll also be tackling other issues like writing in a later cast. Again, apologize for the failure of the slides to show. We finally managed to get it up and running in the end, a little bit. I've just been handed a note to say that we've also got some people listening to us from the UK, Hairi, and the Philippines as well. Are you okay for us to carry on with more questions and answers?
Yes, if there are more questions, I'm happy to answer them.
If you just joined us, Pete is answering questions on the listening and reading part of the IELTS test. And we just tackled true, false, and no and not given questions. I have a question here about a recommendation for the time for each section. I think that applies to both sections of tests. For example, 20 minutes for each.
So it's about the IELTS reading test, and in the academic reading test, there are 3 texts with either 13 or 14 questions each. And because you've got 1 hour to complete the test, and each text is usually about the same length, then 20 minutes per text is a good plan to have. Especially if you're going to transfer your answers to the answer sheet at the end of each section and not wait until the end of the test. I think with the IELTS general training reading test, it would be a good idea to have a slightly different plan, because Section 1 is the easiest, and then Section 2 gets more difficult, and Section 3 is the most difficult. So it makes sense to allow a little bit more time for Section 3. So perhaps a good plan to have might be 15 minutes for Section 1, 20 minutes for Section 2, and then 25 minutes for Section 3.
Talking about Section 3, we're getting quite a few questions on more advice on the third part of the listening test. Obviously, that is the most difficult part. Can you give us some tips about that and how to manage the third part?
All of the tips that I mentioned earlier around managing your time apply to each section of the listening test. And SJ here, I don't know whether you can share that slide again. I'll try and get the number right this time, because that was from section 3 of the listening test. So it was slide
4, list of listening.
3.
Okay, let's see. Right. Right. So that says how to manage your time in the Ielts listening test.
It's not that one, SJ. Sorry, it's the one before that.
Okay. Slide 3. The one about underlining or circling words?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that the one?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
So, as I explained before, and this tip applies to all sections, but this is the example here is from section 3, is to underline or circle words in the questions that are going to help you remember what you're listening for when the recording starts, without having to read the whole question again. And the one that I didn't finish talking about earlier was question 23, where the question is what, I can't quite read it here. The question is, which book does Dina advise against? And what would be really useful here would be to circle or underline advise against. And the reason for this is that with this type of question in section 3, the recording, the speakers in the recording are probably going to talk about all of those books in the list, but only one of them they're going to say something negative about. The others, they're very likely to say something positive about. So maybe Dina recommends those books, but one book she doesn't recommend, she advises against. So if you, before section 3 starts, if you have circled advise against, when you're listening, you don't have to read the whole question again. You just see what you've circled, and it tells you very clearly what you're listening for, something negative about one of the books. So yeah, my advice for section 3 is the same as my advice for the other sections. It's using your time before the recording starts effectively by circling and underlining words that are going to help you remember easily what you're listening for without having to read the whole question again. This is probably particularly important for section 3 because often the questions might be quite long, so there's a lot to read, and you need to make it as easy as possible because listening and reading at the same time is very difficult.
Okay, thanks for that, Pete. We're going to go for another 10 minutes, and so I'm going to take a couple more questions, and then we'll wrap it up. All right?
Okay.
I do have a couple of questions that have come in about matching. Now, I'm not actually an IELTS expert. I am an expert. I'm not an expert in IELTS, but I'm sort of facilitating the session. So basically, can you give tips about headline matching in reading?
So I think the question's around the list of headings. The list of headings question.
Okay.
And it's difficult, I guess, to give a tip clearly without an example to show. And particularly for those people who don't know what this type of question looks like, it's not going to be very clear, I guess. But what I can say with this particular type of question, so this is in IELTS reading, it's the type of question where you have to match headings to paragraphs or headings to sections of a text. I do actually have a time-saving tip that I hope people can understand without seeing an example. With the list of headings, there is often an example given. So one answer is given. And it's easy to miss the fact that this example is given. I've done that myself when doing a test, and I've seen IELTS candidates do that. They didn't notice that an example was given, and they spend time trying to answer the question that has already been answered. So when you see a list of headings question, the first thing you should do is to see if there's an example given, and if there is, to cross out that heading and cross out that section so that you don't waste time trying to answer a question that you've already been given the answer for. I hope without seeing an example that's clear enough.
Okay, I'm sure it's something that we can address if we have time next time when we do a writing one. I have one question, which is a sort of general question. It's about the IELTS life skill test. So is that okay for us to ask that question? You okay to answer?
I guess because it's not so much on topic of IELTS listening and IELTS reading, and particularly around managing your time, I think it would be better to focus questions on those. We can always answer those questions in the comments section later.
Okay, we will definitely do that then. Okay, I think, right, we have a question here, which is one last question.
Okay.
Is it wise to take the answer from the passage as much as possible as long as it fits in the word count? I'm guessing this is a reading question. So is it wise to take the answer from the passage as much as possible as long as it fits in the word count? I don't think they mean plagiarizing, but
I think it's necessary to take the word from the text or words from the text to answer the questions. It's not about being wise or not. That's what you need to do. The only exception is where you are given a choice of words to choose from to put in your answer that aren't from the text. But the majority of questions where you have to use a word from the text, so sentence completion questions, note completion, you have to take the exact word or words from the text. You shouldn't use your own words.
All right. So I guess I guess the question, is it mandatory to read the first sentence and last sentence of a paragraph in a reading test? I mean, I guess that's a must. I mean, you really should read the first and the last sentence.
It depends what you're trying to understand. You know, if you're trying to understand the main idea of the text quickly, then there are some parts of the text that are more important to read than others. The title.
Okay, I think
the first paragraph, the first sentence of each body paragraph, because that's often gives the main idea of each paragraph. And that can give you the main idea of the text quite quickly.
Okay. I'm going to have to interrupt you for a second because Fortunately, while you were talking, we had a bit of a technical hitch, and you kind of froze a bit. So do you mind just sort of redoing that last bit again?
So
Sorry.
the question is it necessary to read the first and last sentence of each paragraph?
Yes.
Yeah.
In the written test, yeah.
So my answer was that it depends on what you're trying to understand from the text. And if you're trying to understand the main idea of the text quite quickly, there are some parts of the text that are more important for you to read than others. The introduction, so the introductory paragraph, the title, of course, the title, any pictures there are, the introductory paragraph, the first sentence of each body paragraph often gives the main idea of each paragraph. And so that can give you the main idea of a text quite quickly. And some IELTS reading questions ask you about the main idea of a text. But other types of question are focusing on other parts of information, in the text.
So basically, the advice is you read with intent. So consider what it is that you need to find out first, and then read that way.
Exactly, and that's the key to IELTS reading. It's reading the right parts of the text slowly and carefully, and whether that's the right parts of the text to give you the main idea, or whether that's certain section of the text.
Okay, sections of the text. I think that's our signal to sort of wrap it up, because you're starting to freeze up on us. We have okay, so we're going to have to wrap up here. So I'm going to say goodbye to Pete for now. I'm not going to take him off the screen just yet. But thank you very much for joining us this evening. It's taken a bit longer than we thought it would be, but we've had lots of engagement, a lot of questions being asked, and a lot of answers. We hope you found the session useful. And we will be running another two sessions in a few weeks' time. And for those of you who missed any of the sessions, we'll be posting these on Facebook very, very shortly. Thank you very much for joining us, and I hope we'll see you again next time. So keep an eye out we'll be announcing those sessions very, very soon. Thank you very much. Have a good rest of the evening or rest of the day, wherever you are. See you later.
Bye-bye.